The return of the shadows. My grandfather was never a man of many words. He was always a person with a firm and silent presence. He was one of those men whom rural life forges in silence, a tireless worker who had spent his entire life in San Luis Potosí taking care of his land. But when I was little, there was a story that, despite his habit of being silent, he told me one winter night. He did so by the fire, when the shadows of the house were lengthening, and it seemed as if the wind was whispering to the ancient through the cracks. This story is something quite personal, something that connects me with my grandfather, and boy has it accompanied me as a warning or perhaps as a mystery that my grandfather wanted me not to forget. He was talking about something that had marked him forever, something that few in his town spoke about openly, only the elderly dared to mention it, and they did so with fear. In La Voz, that story was related to the appearance of an entity known to many as El Charro Negro. It all started when my grandfather, who was a robust young man. In those days he worked long hours on his ranch. His life was simple but dignified, like that of all the peasants who lived from the hard work of their land. Although small, they were fertile, and their life followed an orderly and calm rhythm until she began to notice that something strange was happening on the ranch. At first it was only small details, tools that were moved around, strange lights that appeared in the distance in the fields when the moon barely appeared in the sky. Then some animals began to act strangely. The cows, normally calm, shook in the night, mooing in a way my grandfather couldn't explain. The dogs barked in the dark, always looking at each other in the same corner of the ranch, a place where no one was supposed to be. Grandfather tried not to give it much importance. It was the field, and strange noises are often heard, and the animals sometimes behave unpredictably. However, one night something changed forever. He told me that he had gone out one afternoon to check It was one of those winter nights when the air is cold as a knife. The sky seemed to be closer to earth. As he was crossing the corral, he heard a sound in the distance. It was the trot of a horse, but not just any horse, it was a firm, heavy trot, the sound of a large animal approaching the ranch. At first he thought it was his neighbor who had gotten lost in the mountains. However, when the sound grew louder, he could sense something strange in the air. There was a weight, a sense of oppression that made it stop. It was then that he saw him in the distance. A rider appeared in the shadows of the trees, but he was no ordinary horseman. He was wearing a black suit impeccable like that of a charro, but of a blackness so deep that it seemed to absorb the light. His horse was equally dark, a powerless beast whose eyes shone like two burning coals. The rider, whom my grandfather immediately recognized as the black charro, had his face covered by a wide hat, and although he could not see the eyes, my grandfather felt his gaze fixed on him. He was paralyzed. He knew the stories, and since he was a child he had heard about the famous black charro, an entity that, according to the elders of the town, appeared only for those who were indebted to the afterlife, to dark forces that could not be understood. No one really knew if it was an evil spirit or a demon, but they all agreed on one thing. If you saw it, you were doomed. The black charro did not move. At first he stood there, motionless, watching my grandfather as if he were evaluating him. Then, slowly he moved forward to his horse, getting a little closer. My grandfather, though terrified, forced himself not to run. He knew that, if he did, El Charro would follow him. It was an unwritten rule, but everyone knew it. You should never turn your back on it. El Charro stopped a few meters from him, and that's when he spoke. He did it with a voice that, according to my grandfather, resonated more in his mind than in his ears. "You owe me something," El Charro said in a deep, deep voice. "I have come to collect." My grandfather, although trembling with fear, did not understand what he meant. He hadn't no obscure deal, and he had not made a pact with anything or anyone, but El Charro did not move. His words were clear. Someone had to pay a debt. He raised his hand slowly, pointing at him. At that moment, my grandfather felt a chill that pierced him to the bone. It was a different cold, one that had nothing to do with the winter night. It was a kind of cold that only comes from death. In desperation, my grandfather knelt down and didn't know what else to do. His voice trembled as he spoke. I have no debts," he said with difficulty. "I don't know why you're me." Searching, El Charro was silent for a moment and then spoke again. "Debts are not always yours," he said before turning the horse sharply and disappearing into the darkness. That night my grandfather did not sleep and remained in the corral until dawn, waiting for the light of day to protect him from what he had just seen. When the sun finally rose, he felt safer, but he knew that something had changed in him from that night. My grandfather was never the same again. Tools that used to move from place to place are now completely gone. The lights in the field became more frequent, but they were not like before. They were brighter and more persistent lights. The cows were dying one by one, always at night, and the dogs stopped barking and only whimpered huddled in the corners. The feeling of being watched never left him. Sometimes when he walked around the ranch, he felt like something was following him. Other times when he returned home, he found the doors open as if someone had been there in his absence. I couldn't ignore what was there. It happened, but I didn't know how to deal with it either. Over time, rumors began to circulate in the town. Some said that my grandfather had made a dark deal, that El Charro Negro had come for him because he owed him something more than his soul. Others said that the ranch was cursed and that the mountain did not want him there. But my grandfather never spoke about that night again except that time with me when he was an old man. A few months after the appearance of the Charro, the news spread that the man from a nearby community had. He was found dead in his home. According to rumors, the man had made a deal years ago by selling his soul in exchange for wealth. When my grandfather heard this, he didn't say anything, but his eyes told me the truth. The Charro Negro hadn't come for him. He had come to collect a debt, but it was not his. That man from the neighboring community had paid the price. I never knew if my grandfather felt relieved, if the presence of the Charro had marked him forever. What I do know is that the ranch was never the same after that. My grandfather left. From working the land, he ended up selling his ranch and then bought another. Over the years he made his life, and although so much time has passed and people stopped talking about the Charro Negro, I will never forget his story because there are things that we do not understand, things that belong to another world, and sometimes those things come back to remind us that there are debts that can never be paid. Here I have to make an additional comment to explain one thing, and that is that the man who passed away who had supposedly made the deal with the Black Charro was the original owner of those lands that he had sold to my grandfather. Some time ago he probably tried to become clever and sold the land to get rid of that deal, but finally the Black Charro found him. My name is Ivana Lopez, and this is an experience that my sister and I lived when we were teenagers. It was an ordinary early morning and we were in our room watching movies. It would be around 3 a.m. Our two-story house had always had something strange, especially in the upstairs room that remained empty that night. While we were concentrating on the film, we began to hear noises coming from the upstairs room. Footsteps, furniture moving, knocking. We plucked up the courage and went up together to investigate, but we didn't find anything out of the ordinary. We returned to the room nervously, and it was then that we heard something that made our blood run cold. A voice that was shouting the name of my sister, Daniela. Of course, we went up again, and this time we saw it. He was a clothed man. As Charro was standing in a corner of the room immobile watching us, we ran down in terror and waited for our father to arrive. When we told him what had happened, he didn't believe us. He went upstairs to check, and when he came back he told us that there was absolutely nothing and no one. He tried to reassure us by saying that perhaps we had dreamed or imagined things. A few days passed and we left them behind, or at least that's what we tried, but one weekend we had a family reunion at our house. That night the noises came again this time. We are not the only ones who listened to them. Our relatives also noticed it. Although they tried to ignore them so as not to scare us, we knew that they had heard them too. When the meeting was over, my dad finally admitted that he had heard footsteps and knocks coming from the upstairs room. He went up again, and although he didn't find anything or anyone, he noticed something disturbing. It was the dust accumulated on the floor. There were clearly the prints of boots. It wasn't long before my parents made a decision to move. We ended up moving. My mom used to say that house was, and no one wanted to find out more. To this day we still do not understand what it was that inhabited that room, but what is certain is that we were not welcome. The Nun of Cinema. I want to share an experience that I lived while working at Cinépolis de Lázaro Cárdenas, an experience that to this day makes my hair stand on end. From the moment I went to work, there was a strange and heavy vibe, as if something invisible inhabited the rooms. I was part of the cleaning crew, which meant that I often had to walk in the sun to empty rooms. All the most disturbing were 1, 8, and 9. These are also the largest. One Saturday morning we arrived early, around 7, to start cleaning. At that time we were only the cleaning team, since the manager and the rest of the staff arrived after 10 a.m. A colleague was cleaning the bathrooms when he suddenly heard someone flush one of the toilets. Intrigued, he peeked out and for his horror saw some feet, black shoes and a long dress like the one worn by the women. When he bent down to get a better look at it, he let out a deep groan, a prisoner of fear. My partner ran out to tell us what had happened. We decided to go to the bathrooms together, although the truth is that we were scared to death. As soon as we reached the entrance, we heard someone pulling the toilet again, but this time there was no one there. At that moment, panic took hold of us and we ran away. We returned to the room to continue working, although with fear he did not let us concentrate. Later I had to live my own encounter with the paranormal. In room 9 I was cleaning the cup holders alone and I was wearing my headphones, but suddenly I heard. It was pretty clear. I thought it was my imagination, so I tried to ignore it and went about my business. However, the sound came back louder. This time I turned my head, but no one was there. I tried to calm down and kept working, but then I heard him again, more insistent and closer. It was getting stronger and stronger. I swear my mind doesn't. He endured more and I ran out of the room with tears in my eyes. I looked for my partner to tell her what had happened, and she had to help me finish the cleaning, and I helped her later so we were not alone. From that day on, Costa was inhabited by being alone in the rooms, especially number 9. I never felt at ease working there again, and I still wonder what or who inhabited that place next to us. Stories of the Lara Torres family. It was 2016. He was a policeman in Coronango, Puebla at the time. The officer in charge of the shift didn't have a patrol buddy because he had left to take a course, so they assigned me as his buddy for the whole day. The shift passed calmly and the night was no different. About 3 in the morning I began to feel sleepy,